Hello, and thank you for tuning in. This is the second episode of the Young Conservatives for Christ podcast. My name is Jeremiah Ambrose, and I am the National Director for the Young Conservatives for Christ. Today, I'll be interviewing Matthew Cliff, and we'll be talking about Cherish Life Queensland, which is the organisation that he heads up, and we'll be looking at particularly abortion and euthanasia. These are two crucial issues at the moment, as with the passing of the abortion legislation in WA, abortion up until birth is now legal in every state and territory in Australia. And euthanasia is also legal in every state and territory in Australia. This is a crucial time for Australia and for the issue of life. And we are so thankful for organisations like Cherish Life, who are still championing the cause of life and the sanctity of life in Australia. So, before we get into this interview, how can you get involved in the Young Conservatives for Christ? Well, we are a youth-based initiative, ages 14 to 30, and we focus on issues of faith, family, and life. So if you are interested in joining, we do all sorts of campaigns, we do all sorts of educational things, we give speaking opportunities. So contact us at ycfc.contact@gmail.com, that's ycfc.contact@gmail.com, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. If you want to join, contact us at the same email. But if you just have questions, still use the same email or use our socials, contact us through our socials, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. We are a new initiative, so if you join now, you can have your say in how we go into the future. So please join in. We'll have Bible studies fortnightly, all sorts of things. Please, if you are interested, reach out to us and we'll get back to you soon. Enjoy the interview.
Yeah, my name's Matthew Cliff. So I head up an organisation called Cherish Life, and Cherish Life is a pro-life organisation. We're one of the oldest in Australia. So we've been around for just over 50 years, and we're one of the largest in terms of supporters as well, still today. I came over from the UK, emigrated a year ago. Last September, and took up the role straight away in October. So it's been a bit of a learning curve for me. The UK is a bit different to Australia, even politically. So I've been adapting and learning all things Australia, really.
Yeah. And Cherish Life and the pro-life movement more broadly have been involved in a number of crucial campaigns recently in Australia. Could you briefly touch on what some of those have been?
Yeah, so we've obviously all our day-to-day really is looking to educate the churches and things like that, but we also do a lot of our advocacy work as well, and that's kind of what we do on a day-to-day basis, really. So that might be meeting MPs or writing articles or anything like that. The two major ones since I've been in the role, we've actually had two Senate inquiries. The first one was in the universal access to abortion. So this is kind of the abortion lobby really trying to push through unlimited access to abortion really across Australia. The second one was put through it's called the Babies Born Alive Bill. I don't know if you've heard about that. So this was put through by Senator Matt Canavan, Senator Alex Antic, and Senator Ralph Babette. And basically this is to provide protection for babies who've been born alive as a result of a failed abortion procedure. So that was just recently, and a report came out in August. So we were in Canberra at the Senate here and there, basically giving testimony as well. So that's the major two things that are really took much of our time up this year, really.
Yeah, and your work around the Born Alive Bill. I did recently watch your speech to the Senate. Could you just go a little bit more into the bill itself and the situation regarding babies left to die in Australia?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, Jeremy, I was shocked to find out about that this was happening because, in the UK, abortion is still in criminal law. obviously you guys have got it now, especially in Queensland from 2018 right up until birth, really. And what happens, especially in third trimester abortions as well, but it can happen in other abortions as well, is that often if the procedure doesn't work, then these babies ultimately there can be some babies that have been born alive. So from 2010, for example, to 2020, the only statistics we have at the moment are from Queensland and Victoria. And basically, there are 724 babies that have been born alive and essentially left to die. And what we mean by that is that especially in Queensland at the minute, the guidelines for medical practitioners, they are not allowed to give these babies any kind of treatment to keep them alive, essentially. So that could be oxygen, IV lines, that type of thing. That is prevented from these babies. Essentially, because they have no rights. And ultimately, what we're trying to say is, look, obviously we have an issue with abortion itself, but at a very basic level, this is a child that is born. Do you know what I mean? So this is a completely different kettle of fish, really. That if it was any other child, you'd expect healthcare practitioners to offer them the basic care that they need. But sadly, that there is children in Australia who that is prevented from, which is, I think, is a tragedy, really.
Yeah. And you mentioned that obviously this is a more extreme circumstance that still happens. But we still you do still focus on the abortion movement. It seems the pro-life movement now, more than ever, it seems, has the scientific grounds to say that life begins at conception. I heard one scientist that argues that life does begin at conception. He said that it was now no longer a matter of opinion over whether or not life begins at conception, but a fact. There are some people who accept this and say that it doesn't actually matter. The woman's right to choose precedes the baby's right to life. How can we even respond to an argument like this?
Yeah, I think you're bang on. I think you're correct. So previously, the argument really around abortion was ultimately about when does life occur? Do you know what I mean? When does life begin? Now, due to scientific advances in technology and medical technology, that question is no longer guesswork or mysterious. We know when life begins now. And we know that because of the science of embryology. So that isn't a religious argument, that's a scientific argument. You know, in 1981, there was a Senate committee meeting in America, and one of the doctors was a lady called Dr. Matthews Roth. He was a professor at Harvard, and she says it's scientifically correct now to say that life begins at conception. So again, that's not a religious statement, that's a scientific statement. Obviously, I have a religious perspective on that as well, but ultimately, scientifically, the case is shut now. You know, you cannot deny that life begins at conception. And ultimately, the pro-abortionists know this now. They actually conceded these defeats, these debates. So Anne Furady, for example, she used to head up the biggest abortion provider in the UK, which was called BPAS, and she concedes that debate now. You see, the question for the pro-abortionists now is not when does life begin, but when does life begin to matter? And that's a philosophical question now. So that's ultimately what we're discussing here. It's a question about value. It's about when the unborn has value, and so that's the way the conversation is. You still hear kind of, you know, trickles of the old arguments like, oh, it's a bunch of cells and all that type of stuff. But ultimately now the real pro-abortionists who are engaging in this discussion have conceded that debate.
Yeah. And you mentioned already that it's coming down to a philosophical argument. So do you think this really does have to come down to first principles? It does have to come down to faith and to our belief in God. Do you think that has to play a key role in how we now respond to these new lines of arguing?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. As a Christian, obviously I'm a believer in Christ, and it comes actually down to authority. Every single ethical theory has an authority, and what I mean by that is they have you could say a first principle where they go to answer this question. Now, for the Christian for myself, who has a high view of the Bible, I go to the Word of God. Ultimately, it's His voice that I turn to first. So yeah, that's where I go, and that informs my perspective on the unborn. And it's much more difficult when you in it from a secular point of view, because they obviously naturally don't have a high view of the Bible, so they will often turn to whoever's the de facto experts. Do you know what I mean? And that could be, for example, ethically, that could be a guy called Peter Singer, who's had a big influence in this discussion. But as a secularist, if life is only matter, it doesn't, and you can be disposed of and things like that, then you're going to have a completely different perspective to a Christian, for example. And that's what we're seeing actually at its core is a clash of authority as well. We can make an argument, a human rights based argument, of course, but ultimately, it's got to. Is it persuasive for them? Obviously, we're seeing it's not. So it can become a real tricky conversation when engaging with a secularist, for example.
Yeah, and obviously, a huge issue is the abortion itself. But what is the pro-life movement, and what are organisations like Cherish Life Queensland doing in terms of supporting mothers who perhaps can't look after their babies?
Yeah, I mean, we actually we don't get involved in the kind of crisis pregnancy work per se. Not to say that we don't value it. Yep. It's just that's not our, if you like, that's not our mission. But we support them. We love them. So when I go and do talks, that's always the question really is, okay, what's for these women? And I will always point them to these crisis pregnancy centres who are doing absolutely invaluable work as well. We just have a different mandate, whereas we're more doing education and the advocacy work. So yeah, but we're all part of the same movement and as vital as each other.
Yeah, absolutely. And another issue that Cherish Life I know covers, and that is still on this line of the sanctity of life. Euthanasia or assisted suicide is another key issue around this. What is the situation in Australia right now? Or perhaps maybe we'll stick with Queensland in terms of their euthanasia laws. And what is Cherish Life doing in this regard?
Yeah, so in January 2023, euthanasia or assisted suicide became legal ultimately, and that now has become just another medical procedure as well as abortion, sadly. And yeah, it's a real tricky one. Obviously, it's a devastating one, because what's going to happen here is they're always going to push for more legislation, and ultimately now what's happening is this suicide is being treated as a health option now. So it's a devastating time. The concerns are really is not only is there massive mental health issues around this issue anyway, but as the age of consent drops as well, that becomes a concern. If you've got young girls, young boys who feel like this is an option for them, rather than exhausting all the other options, it becomes even more tragic. And we're going to hear these tragic stories as this plays itself out, unfortunately.
Yeah. And what sort of, sorry, you might have already mentioned it, but I didn't quite catch it.
Yeah.
What sort of restrictions are in place in terms of who can have it? Because I know if we're talking about some Scandinavian countries, it's even minors can have it, and people who have mental issues as well. So what are the restrictions in place currently in Queensland?
Yeah, I don't. So we're not at the place where minors can have it ultimately at the moment. I don't have the actual guidelines to hand here, but yeah, we're not at that stage yet. But obviously that will become a discussion moving on into the future. So, yeah.
Yeah. And so just back to abortion, and actually I'd like to cover both if I could. With the passing of abortion legislation in WA, all states and territories in Australia now have abortion available up until birth, depending on the circumstances of the mother. And euthanasia is also now legal in every state and territory in Australia with varying restrictions. So what is next for the pro-life movement? Where can we get our hope from?
That's a great question. I've come over again from being kind of in a defensive mode with the abortion laws in the UK, and then obviously coming to Australia. You guys, if you like, are on the other side of the fence, and this is new for me. It's no longer are you defending legislation; it's kind of the legislation's gone now. So although that's obviously a tragedy, and very, very deeply disturbing and a bad indictment on Australia, for the movement, it puts us in another position in terms of, okay, strategically, where do we go from here? And I'd say this ultimately, where we get our hope from as Christians is that Jesus is still on the throne. Do you know what I mean? That's not changed. So we gather our hope and our confidence from that, ultimately knowing that what we're doing is a righteous cause and the Lord's called us to it. So we just have to keep pressing on now. And for every organization, it'll probably look a bit different. What we're hoping to do at Cherish Life, because we've been so, because of the legislation that's come through recently since 2018 to obviously 2023 with euthanasia, our work, if you like, our engagement has been very political based, which has had to be, they've had no choice, bless them, the organization. My heart personally, and hopefully I can bring this to the organization, is we really need to start building a consensus again, I think, in the church. Part of I actually did, I'm doing a PhD now as well, and I did a master's degree looking at how the church in the UK engage with this issue. And often the problem is we assume that the church know where they stand on this issue. I think that's naive. The church, the church itself is all over the shop on this issue. For example, my research showed that 64% of evangelicals in the UK didn't know where they stood on the issue. We're inconclusive. So there's a lot of work to be done first and foremost, if you like, at stage one in the church before we get to the political advocacy, which we'll always be involved in that. Of course we will. But what we need to do, I think, in the movement is build a consensus again, which gives us leverage, with MPs and things like that. So that would be my hope for the organisation is, every organisation has a different mandate, but for us, certainly, we think that we need to start engaging the church again in an educational campaign.
Yeah. My next question was to ask, do we need more involvement from the church? What role does the church have to play? If you wanted to add anything to that.
Jeremiah, it's a great question. And I think, the thing, this is what happens with abortion. A lot of church leaders, and I was a pastor in the UK as well, so I can empathise with them. But the issue is this, that we see abortion primarily as a political issue. And that's actually wrong. What I would say to church leaders is actually, first and foremost, this is a theological issue. So what that does is, once I frame it that way to church leaders, is they have to realize that they also have responsibility for what's going on in this nation with regards to these children. It's not like, oh, that's a political issue, we leave it to the politicians or those type of people doing that type of work. No, you've got to see it as the reason we're at this situation in our culture, in our society, is because ultimately the church hasn't been doing the educational work that it should have been doing. And that's, in terms of how we engage the church, is to put abortion basically back on the map. I'm convinced this is the biggest moral issue, not only of our day. World Health Organization says there's 73 million abortions a year. There's 100,000 abortions in Australia that we know of. 1 in 4 women in Australia will have an abortion. So this is not a fringe issue. And I actually think this is one of the biggest moral issues of all time, if not the biggest ones, because the numbers are mind-blowing. They're overwhelming. They're incomprehensible, to be honest. And I really feel that the Lord is looking to the church to say, look, what are you guys doing on this issue?
Yeah. And in terms of political parties, are there any parties that have thrown support behind organizations like yours, or is it, or are, in terms of the major parties at least, or are they both quite far onto the anti-life side, I guess?
Yeah. See, this political landscape is very similar to the UK as well. So, for example, in America, where you may have obviously the Democrats and Republicans, Democrats have really embraced obviously an anti-life ideology, whereas Republicans, you will have the majority are probably not embraced that ideology. In the UK, what you find is you have one party who again have embraced that ideology, and then the other party have kind of adopted a soft position on that issue. And I'm fine, I could be wrong, but I'm finding the same in Australia, where I find obviously the Labour have totally embraced an anti-life ideology, but Liberal Party as well, again, the other mainline party, have kind of adopted a soft position on abortion, which is a bit of a tragedy. There are, of course, some politicians who are pro-life within the party, and we value them. But majoritively, it would seem to me that they've adopted this kind of soft position. So again, I think that's evidenced in the legislation which has come through. You know what I mean? So I think we can confidently say that the political sphere generally in Australia has adopted this kind of ideology wholesale. So again, it's not only the churches that need education, it's not only individual society, but we need to educate the MPs as well. So that's obviously what we're trying to do also.
And I just had one other question. In terms of obviously this is over in America, Roe v. Wade being overturned. Did that help at all in terms of the momentum in the pro-life movement elsewhere, including Australia, or not really?
Well, I can't really comment, to be honest, because I wasn't here at the time. But I obviously in the kind of slipstream from that, I think it encouraged people. I think it was an encouragement to say, look, if we can get together and build up a strong argument and make a real stand, get the people out, then we can have a real effect. And that's politics generally. Again, the currency in politics is votes. So if we can get enough people out to again put life first ultimately in what they're trying to do, then we can. I think we should look to America and think, that can encourage us. But on the opposite side, I think what's happened is it's actually also ramped up the pro-abortion work as well, because they use that now to say, oh, look at what's happening in America. So there's a lot of fear mongering as well. But again, we don't. I think it obviously been positive what's happened in America, but Australia contextually is completely different. We've got a lot more work to do, I think.
Yeah. And just finally, where can people find Cherish Life's work and how can they get involved?
So you can go on our website, which is www.cherishlife.org.au. And please sign up, become a supporter, and you'll get our emails and things like that. And if you consider donating, that'd be fantastic as well. We obviously battle a multi-billion-dollar industry, and we need funding for impact ultimately. So if that's something, this is an issue that God places on your heart, please consider us in donating to us. We've got social media as well, obviously Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. So
Perfect. Thanks so much for your time.
Cheers, Jeremiah.